Welcome to Saltgrass, a show about how local communities can engage with the climate crisis at a grassroots level. My name is Ali Hanley. And welcome to Season 4. I had not planned to take a full 2 months off between seasons, but here we are, 2 months later. And something pretty amazing happened in this 2 months between seasons. In the world of community radio, you do your show and just hope that some people are listening. I've spent years making radio shows this way. It is really good in that you do your show and whoever was listening at the time is it. It's gone. There's no lasting record. Mistakes get lost in time and you move on. There's no pressure to get it perfect. But there's also no way to measure it aside from audience feedback and interaction. In the world of podcasting, you do get to see how many people are listening or downloading your episodes. I try not to track this too obsessively, though it is a bit addictive, much like chasing social media hits. On this extended break between seasons, I was doing a bunch of behind-the-scenes stuff for the podcast, and I did check in to see how much activity there was every now and then. While I'm not providing fresh content, the existing shows still tick over slowly as people find them and have a listen. And funnily enough, it was during this period of inactivity that I watched the numbers climb very slowly and tick over the 10,000 download mark. And that is quite a milestone. So I just want to say thank you very much for listening. It's amazing to think that people around the world are listening to these stories from my small town in central Victoria. Now, I don't know how many of you listening are subscribed to the Saltgrass email list. You can do that via saltgrasspodcast.com. But if you are, you'd know that Season 4 was going to involve stories from a little bit further afield than just my hometown. You'd also know that we had a big trip to Western Australia planned, from which I was hoping to bring home a bunch of stories from a group called Desert Discovery. But alas, as our nation is not very well vaccinated, we have had to shut our state borders once again as a new wave of COVID-19 cases started spreading from Sydney and then around the rest of Australia. So now I don't know what Season 4 will look like. Maybe it was foolish to even say my plans out loud in the current environment, but there you go, I did, and now it's all changed. Regardless, there are still plenty of stories from this region to explore, and today's episode is one of them. So I'm going to be speaking with a local ecologist, Karl Just. Karl is a guy I've known for about 15 years. He was good friends with a housemate of mine back in Melbourne, and then a few years later we found ourselves living in the same small town. As with so many of these shows, I interview someone I have known around town for a while. I don't know them very well, but I have an inkling that they're doing some interesting things. And it's not until I sit down and start talking in depth with them for this show in the interview that I get to see just how interesting they are. So Karl is an ecologist, and what made me want to talk to him is that he actually knows what the Australian saltgrass plant is and what it does in the environment. And from that topic, we end up talking about butterflies, ants, and the very nature of nature. As ever, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that saltgrass is produced on Jara country. Jara country is the traditional home of the Dja Dja Wurrung people, who have been custodians and caretakers of this land for tens of thousands of years. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
Salt of the earth. Salt. Grassroots. Salt of the earth people. Grassroots change. Saltgrass.
Listen to all episodes of Saltgrass on your podcast app or at saltgrasspodcast.com. Karl, you are one of the only people that I know who, when I say saltgrass, which is the name of this show, obviously, you actually know what the plant is.
And I throw the scientific name at you.
Yeah, go on. What is it?
It's Desticlus testicula.
Wow.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, Testicus is a botanical term, so I'd have to draw you a diagram, but it's a certain arrangement of the leaves. Yep. It's kind of a very neat arrangement. So if you've looked at the plant online, you might have seen that very neat way the leaves are lined up, and that's Testicus.
Yeah, cool.
So yeah, Testicaphylla.
Testicaphylla.
Yeah.
And so phylla means leaf, like foliage? Or?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
I'm not that great with my Latin, but I know that much. Yeah, I know a little bit.
Well, you know a little bit because you're an ecologist and you know a lot of plants and their botanical names.
Yeah.
Great. So what do you know about this plant? Because even Google searching it, I can hardly find anything. I do know there's an Australian variety of it, and it is quite good in salty environments, which I guess is why it's called saltgrass. So maybe if you tasted it, it would taste salty because it actually draws the salt out of the soil and holds it. I don't know. I'm making that up. I don't know if that's true. What do you know about the plant?
To be honest, I'm not sure if I had a chew on this one, but I don't think it has the saltiness. Like, it's not herby enough for that. But yeah, that's the key feature of this grass is you find it in really salt-affected environments and habitats. So that might be coastal salt marsh. So if you're right down on the coast, there's a range of places you'll find it. And it's rhizomatous. So if you don't know what that means, it's a lot of plants have these underground storage organs, particularly grasses, where they'll kind of send up shoots from this underground network. So if you know Cooch, you probably do if you're in Castlemaine. Yeah. That lovely thing that you dig out of your garden every 5 minutes.
And then it comes back. It's like a zombie. It just doesn't die.
Exactly, that one.
Yeah.
So it has a similar habit to that, a similar way of growing. And a lot of wetland plants, because this is actually a bit of a wetland plant too, it's in salty environments, but often near salty wetlands. So areas that get a bit damp and can get flooded. So a lot of wetland plants have this rhizomatous habit because what happens if it gets flooded and the top of the plant might die off, it's a very convenient way of just growing back from these underground storage organs. So
they're not roots, they're just underground storage organs.
Yeah, they're kind of above the roots.
Yeah.
So if you dig up Cooch, it's got the roots and then it's got these like fleshy parts, which are the rhizomes.
And it sends off these little shoots that go underground. And then it just pops up a little head
a
metre across, even further away from where the original plant is.
Exactly. So what you end up in the end is like a large patch of this thing. We call this one Australian saltgrass. So it's mostly on the coast, but you'll get it not mostly on the coast, you'll get it inland as well. And it's also a bit of a coloniser, so you'll get it in a lot of country that's affected by salinisation. So
that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, cool.
Salinisation's been a big problem in Australia as farming practices and various other land management issues happen. We have this salt problem that arises, which is really hard to recover from, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's a major problem. It's really widespread, and particularly in the kind of a lot of the Murray-Darling kind of basin area where there's a lot of irrigation. So if you go up towards northern Victoria around, say, the Kerrang area, there's a lot of country that's been affected by salinisation, and there's a lot of these kind of salt marsh communities that have developed, which probably wouldn't have really been there naturally. There would have been some natural salt marsh because there would have been areas where groundwater did outcrop, but now that the whole groundwater has risen, you get a lot more salt. And
so the groundwater rising is part of the issue, isn't it? That's what brings the salt to the surface. Is that
exactly,
right?
Yeah. So essentially clearance of all the trees, so you're not as much drawing up the water and using that, as well as just the whole groundwater rising, many metres because of so much water being poured onto the land. So, yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
And so then the salt then stays at the surface level, which then makes the soil uninhabitable for a lot of other plants. Is that right?
So you get a lot of country where trees will die back, can kill red gums, black box, all that through a lot of that country, and the whole understory will change. So you might have had kind of a lot of freshwater plants or certain kind of plant community, and that can get completely replaced by these salt plants. And there's a lot of kind of more succulent salt plants you get nearby to where you might get saltgrass. But yeah, saltgrass is one of the plants when you go head up to some of that salt country around, say, Kerrang and northern Victoria, you can find Australian saltgrass around. And it's actually, it's doing a good thing because now that the saltiness has happened, you want something growing there. So it's good that there are some native plants that can adapt and grow in those areas. So it's kind of colonising areas where it might not have been once, but it's still, holding things together and playing a role.
So that there's not complete erosion.
Yeah, well, you'd have erosion, you'd have no plants, not much more for a food web, all that kind of thing. So you need to have some kind of plants, and it's better having lots of invasive weeds and things. So the salt marsh communities you get inland, and you do get plenty of natural. Just to emphasise, you get plenty of natural inland salt communities all the way through Australia. Yeah, because a lot of our groundwater, particularly when you get in more arid areas, is quite salty because of low rainfall. So over time, because you get salts blowing in over 1,000 years from the ocean, it just accumulates, and if you're not having lots of fresh water kind of flushing the system, that's why a lot of Australia is quite salty. So where the groundwater outcrops, so a lot of northwest Victoria where you get outcropping of water.
Like the salt lakes.
A lot of salt lakes. Yeah, a lot of salt lakes.
Yeah, cool.
So
with the pink salt.
Yeah, pink salt. There's a place called the Rark Plain, which is up near Haddle Lakes, up towards Mildura. Vast areas of natural salt lakes and amazing vegetation communities with these plants that are highly adapted to salt levels, and that's where you're going to find Australian saltgrass as well. So it's going to be along the coast in kind of salt marsh as well as inland.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
And so does the saltgrass help desalinize the landscape and help it rehabilitate so other plants can come back into that landscape, or is it just actually existing there and stopping further damage through erosion and coexisting with other salt-tolerant sort of ecosystems?
Sure. Look, I don't think it's playing a major role in removing the salt. There has been a lot of trials and some successful work using some larger salt bushes that can kind of have much deeper roots, and they do draw up the salt because they actually use it in their biology. And so they're often growing these salt bushes and using those as fodder for stock, and there's ways of doing that.
Because they bring salt in for stock, don't they? They bring salt licks in for cows because they need it. So if salt bushes can replace that stuff, it sounds like a great combination of...
Yeah, I don't actually know much about the salt licks. I know that I think a lot of the salt bush is actually quite nutritious, so I'm not sure if it's about giving the stock a salt hit, but just, plenty of nitrogen in the leaves, and they're actually quite nutritious, so they can use some of these salt bushes. And I don't know if you've ever tried, you can eat some of your local things like your berry salt bush, or things like some of your local, well, they're not quite local to here, but a bit further north, there's some Atriplex salt bush species which you can eat the foliage and it tastes okay. You can put it in salads. So
yeah, we bought a plant from Auntie Julie and Murnong Mamas from the local farmers market, and she was saying that it's, I forget in which salt bush it was because we got a couple of varieties from them, but it's got sort of flat silver leaves, and she said, you can just fry them and they taste like chips.
Yeah.
I was like,
delicious.
That sounds great to me.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can eat the berries as well. So I think that's berry salt bush. It's got little, quite these salty, sweet berries as well. So, yeah.
So they're actually more helpful at desalinizing the landscape.
Yeah, I think just some of those larger salt bushes are better at getting that salt out of the ground, and then you can feed to the stock and you're actually removing it from the system. I think Australian saltgrass, it's playing a great role, but I just don't think it's removing salt from the system as much. Maybe in a minor way, but it's not a huge game changer, I suppose.
But it's holding things
together.
together.
I don't want to
No,
talk it up too much.
Don't play down my plant though.
It's saving the world, this thing.
Yeah. Well, it's holding things together until some bigger things can move in and do some better rehabilitation. Yeah, so I guess for me, that plant, when I moved out here to Castlemaine, and I have this garden that is covered in cooch. Yep. And is cooch a native plant to Australia?
There are some native cooches, but not the one that we get all over Castlemaine.
Backyard cooch.
Unfortunately, but there's a very similar one that we actually get along the Murray River on the floodplains. It looks kind of similar, doesn't grow as kind of prolifically. So there are some really close related things.
Because this cooch is like a nightmare. It just grows everywhere, and no matter how much you weed it, it still comes back again. Yep. But I got to a certain point of just having a huge amount of respect for it, because I'm like, this plant, plant's going to survive the apocalypse. Like nothing can kill this plant. Yeah. And so I feel like if saltgrass is a relative of that, I see that as a good symbol of just resilience and being able to just exist in difficult environments, which ultimately with climate change, a lot of us, like, we are going to have to adapt to harsher environments and very difficult conditions.
Definitely. Yeah.
And we're going to have to be low to the ground and know how to survive, wherever we land. And it's, I've always enjoyed that as a kind of a metaphor of something that's like really tough and resilient, stays there and does its thing. Yeah. No matter how much you try and yank it out, you can't get rid of these grassroots movements.
No, I think saltgrass is going to be around for a long time. It's very resilient. It's got that that really thick growth habit, the deep rhizomes, and it can handle drier soils. And like I said, it's a pioneer as well. It's a pioneer moving in and creating new communities too. So.
Yeah, and so ultimately it might be the first plant to go back to a place that's become quite arid.
Or salty.
But once it's established itself, it allows other things to move in and start establishing as well. Yeah,
they'll be mostly part of that same salt community, which might not have been there, but you'll get a small range of salty plants, like native salty plants, which will start moving in. So it's definitely playing a role,
Interesting. So tell me how you know all about this. Can I ask you a few questions about you? I know that you do some ecology work, but tell me, a bit about yourself and how come you know all this stuff.
Yeah, sure. So, I have my own consultancy, my own business I've been doing I'll be in my own business for about 7 years, but I've been doing ecology for about 15 or so. I didn't go to uni. I did a diploma course for a couple of years, but I didn't go to university. I mostly just hung out with a lot of elders who knew lots of stuff, because if you're going to learn all your plants and animals, you've got to spend so much time in the bush just like asking people questions and hearing all your bird calls and really getting lots of experience. And I did lots of volunteering in the early days. Now I've got my consultancy and I do lots of survey, mostly around all parts of Victoria. So I travel quite a bit for work, lots of monitoring, lots of survey to try and inventories, that kind of thing.
So inventories of flora and fauna, like what is living in that environment. that you get called out to look at.
Yeah, exactly. But also, I'm really keen on not just monitoring stuff and monitoring decline, but doing lots of activism and conservation work. We've done some really good local projects on the Eltham Copper Butterfly recently, where we've just helped to do some survey to try and find out where they were, because unfortunately the government departments were really set on just burning all their habitats. So we had to go out there and find where they were. So we got a grant and did some survey, and that's been really effective to try and save that species.
I've done an interview with Harley Douglas in a previous episode. So we talked a little bit about the Eltham Copper Butterfly in that episode, but you sort of really tried to develop a sense of community ownership over it to help connect people to it and understand why it's important. Because it's a relatively rare creature, isn't it?
The Eltham Copper?
Yeah,
extremely. It's only known for about 4 separate areas of Victoria. So you get around kind of Eltham, like northern Melbourne, at a few places, and then it's Castlemaine, Bendigo and Kayada, which is out near the Little Desert. And we're about to do some survey at Kayada this year and the Little Desert, because no one's gone out there to really look for them for 10 years or even longer. We don't even know if they're still there. So, that kind of stuff's pretty important.
And they don't migrate or anything. They just sort of have a life cycle in a particular place.
They can migrate, but it seems to be pretty short dispersal, because they've got this you probably talked about that, this obligate relationship with a sweet Becerria plant. I'm not sure if you talked about it with Harley, but it's very specific. And the ant, it needs to have this specific species of ant. So can't just lay its eggs everywhere. It needs to have this ant and this whole quite an intricate relationship with the ant.
But you really need to protect a whole ecosystem to protect that butterfly.
Exactly. It's like, and it's a lot of that. The same story with a lot of our species. You've got to protect the whole community. There's things like orchids which have, pollinators, and you need the pollinator, and the pollinator might need a whole lot of other plants in its community. So if you lose the other plants, then you lose the pollinator, and then you lose the orchid. So it's about, protecting the whole range, not just that thing. Yeah.
And isn't that just the story of our times? I think we live in such a world of like individualism and isolated cases of things where we try and think that every individual thing has its own siloed existence, but actually everything's so interconnected, and we just forget that.
Yeah, I mean, the concept of species is a human construct. Like, there's actually a continuum between all the life forms, and we're, putting them in these little boxes, and taxonomy is constantly changing its mind because it's just a human idea. But so, there's the flow of energy between all life forms and all species. So, it's good not just get kind of focused on one thing or one species, because there is that flow. So
yeah, that's amazing. That's nicely said. And so tell me a bit about the Eltham Copper Butterfly Festival that you started or you were part of, and why that was initiated.
Yeah, sure. Well, that was, so Vanessa Case, that was her big project, and I helped out. I actually first got in contact with Vanessa because we'd had the ideas independently. I wanted to have a bit of a festival at Clymna Park, which I'm still keen on having something going up there, maybe a different kind of event. So anyway, she had this separate idea, and hers was a bit more arty, because she's an artist and she's a dancer, and she wanted to do stuff with kids in schools. So I had some involvement. Vanessa did the vast majority of that, but I helped to came to the schools one day and did some education with the kids. And on the day of the festival, were you there on the festival?
I came for a little bit at the end.
So we did a couple of walks and just took them up, because it was at the Castlemaine Botanical Gardens, and we went up the hill where the butterflies are, and we just showed people the habitat and showed them, and then down in the park they had the lovely dances. And so I think she had the kids doing this amazing dance. It demonstrated the relationship between the ant and the butterfly and all this kind of cool stuff. And
that sounds great.
Yeah, and there was lots of art activities and beautiful music. So so I mean, I think she'd love to do it again, but it was so much, it's such a huge job, and almost need a whole committee to kind of, it's such a huge thing to run a festival.
That's a big event.
Yeah, it was, but it was great fun.
Yeah.
And I think
it seemed very successful. There were so many people there.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, Castlemaine Botanical Gardens, for those who don't know, is this beautiful flat zone with a lake or two, and it's about 5K circuit around the edge of the bottom part of the gardens. And most people, that's where you'd walk your dog, and there's a tea rooms there, so you can hire that out and have an event. And there's grassy bits, and there's trees that were planted when Castlemaine was first settled, and they're ginormous sort of European varieties of trees and things now. They're very impressive, and it's amazing that they've survived in this environment for this long. But across the creek and up the hill, there's a much more bushy, wild part of the gardens, which a lot of people don't take the time to explore. It's got some quite steep tracks, and it's not as well formed, all of that stuff. But it's actually a really beautiful spot.
Yeah.
And that's where I've noticed a little fenced off bit, but it seems quite small. Is that what you've got to protect the butterfly
So
habitat?
that's one of the known places, and that was where they thought the Eltham copper was extinct in the 1980s, and then they rediscovered it at Eltham, and then that year they did these statewide surveys, and a fellow called David Crosby came up to Castlemaine to the back of the gardens there, and I think it was really just out the back of town, like no one went out there back then, and he rediscovered it in Castlemaine as well. So we've got it there, but we've also got it at Clymna Park, where Harley was doing his project. That's where we've got a big population. We're also going to survey up around the Monk, if you know where the Monk is, it's more like south of town, out towards Spring Gully Road area. We're going to survey that this year because there's some populations.
And so that's more bush, isn't it? Like that's proper bush?
Yeah, it's all in the Diggings Park, the Castlemaine Diggings Heritage Park.
Because like the Botanic Gardens, you've got the hospital on one side and the Botanic Gardens on the other side, and houses over there and houses over there and the pub just there. Yeah. So for other areas to be more actually ensconced in proper bushland, it feels more protected.
Like I've got some concern about the Botanical Garden site because we've monitored the last 2 years and the numbers aren't great. They can hang on these small reserves. So in Eltham, where I've monitored the species, it's almost ridiculous. You get these little reserves and they're just surrounded by high density residential houses and swimming pools and all that kind of thing. But the butterfly's still hanging on and they're doing, reasonably well. But there's this huge issue of like they can't disperse and there's not much genetic interchange between populations and inbreeding and all that kind of thing.
So they get really isolated in their small community and then it's inbred.
Yeah. So for a while it was all about focus on the Melbourne populations, and then they started realising that between Castlemaine and Bendigo we have like thousands of hectares of potential habitat. So that's why we're trying to, with Elaine Bays, the two of us have been doing some work just trying to survey these vast areas to find out where the butterflies were. So Clymna Park, we had to survey about 200 hectares. It was quite a...
So what are you looking for?
So we mapped where the Basaria was. Do people know about the relationship, or have you talked about that?
Well, maybe explain it again. I think Harley did talk about it in the previous episode, but people may not have heard that episode. So if you explain the relationship and what's required for the butterfly, that'd be great. Yeah, it's pretty cool. And there's a lot of butterflies that have this relationship, but this people get very fascinated by the Eltham copper, and it's a bit of a flagship. Because it does this thing where it needs this particular ant, which is called Notonchus ant. Notonchus means big head, apparently, in Latin. It's got quite a large head. And it lives at the base, often has these colonies at the base of a sweet Basaria plant. So if you know sweet Basaria, it's in the, I don't know if you know Pittosporum, it's in the same family. But it's a beautiful flowering plant. It's quite spiny. So is it more like, would it look like a bush or is it a tree?
Well, it's a good question because it's quite varied depending where it is. I've gone to, Tasmania and some of the Bass Strait Islands. It's this huge, thick trunked tree that can grow up to, 10, 15 metres. Our local form is almost this little scrambly shrub. It's a much more, just depending on how dry it is, how much rainfall and fertile the soils are. But the Eltham copper only likes it likes the kind of small scrambly form. It doesn't like the tall tree form. So, but it's still, locally it's a beautiful, it gets lots of these white, really nectar-rich flowers, so it's covered in lots of insects.
So the ants like the flowers?
So what happens is the butterfly lands. it's more complex.
Wait for it.
Yeah, I'll get to the punchline.
Okay, great.
So the butterfly pretty much lays its eggs at the base of where the nest is.
Sorry, where the ant nest is?
Yeah, pretty much lay like within centimetres of where the ants are, and they'll all start carrying on. And there's a bit of communication happening between the butterfly and the ant. The ant will come up and actually take the eggs down into the nest, and then the caterpillars hatch in the nest, and they live down there, and they're protected by the ants during the day. And then you get to go, the cool thing is if you go out at night around springtime, you can watch the caterpillars. They only come out at night and they feed on the foliage of the sweet Basaria, and the ants follow them. So they swarm all over the caterpillar's back. And the caterpillars, what they're doing is they're exuding this secretion on their back, which is quite sugary, like it's a sugary kind of reward for the ants. So they're kind of feeding on that and just attending to the ants. And there's a bit of theory they might be stopping kind of fungal infections by doing that as well, because otherwise all the sugars and things, the caterpillars might get infections. Yeah. So they're kind of like just looking after the ants looking after the caterpillars.
But there'd be no reason for the caterpillar to excrete sugary substance unless it had a relationship with the ants.
Well, that's the theory, is that it's like a reward thing. It's I mean, they might need to excrete it in some way. So
do you reckon when the butterflies land and lay their eggs, they're like, you guys remember, if you take care of these eggs, in a few months you'll have these caterpillars. You'll have endless sugar, guys. You should just take care of these eggs. This
is a gold mine. It's like, yeah, totally.
You know the deal, right?
It's just a walking...
Did your grandpa tell you the deal? It's been a while.
It's a walking bag of sugar. It's
great.
That's
right.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's pretty cool. So they look after them, attend to them, and if there's any spiders or wasps or things trying to attack the larvae, then the idea is the ants probably protect them from that. So then eventually, the butterfly emerges as a butterfly, and it'll feed on Baseria flowers. So, the caterpillars eat the leaves, and then the adults might feed on the flowers to some degree. Yeah, so it's a pretty cool story. That's why you need the specific plant and specific ant, and if you lose either, and I know a site in Eltham where the ants have disappeared, and so the butterflies disappeared too. So you need them both there. So.
And I guess in highly urban environments, you're much more likely to have humans using ant rid or some other thing or a pesticide on their garden that drifts across. Or
yeah. Well, unfortunately, I see that a lot. Even down the res one day, I saw someone had poisoned the meat ant nest, and it's pretty sad. There's a bit of a correlation between humans and once you get high density residential land, you tend to get more of these disturbances. And like you said, people don't want the ants and things. If
they don't understand the value of the ants in the ecosystem, they just go, oh, these ants are a pain, I don't want to have to walk across them, therefore I'll kill them. Yeah. Well, I suppose they are quite a small ant that don't tend to they're not going into people's houses and kind of coming across humans as much, but yeah, there's many ways that humans could impact them. Saddest story I heard was in Montmorency, which is near Eltham, north of Melbourne again, where there was a population of Eltham copper, and there was an expert studying them on his property, and some chickens got in from the next door neighbour and found the caterpillars. So it was like peck, delicious lunch.
Yeah, totally. Aww. So I think the more of those, once you start getting the bush being disturbed and kind of altered that way, you do get more of this, that kind of thing. But that's why we're lucky up here. We've got like Kalimna Park and out towards the Monk, where it's just hundreds of hectares of habitat. And is it the sort of thing where if you wanted to create habitat for the butterflies, you would plant the plant and then bring out the ants and try and establish a colony of ants and then bring out some butterflies? Yeah, great question, because we have done that in Eltham. There was some plants planted, and we actually had the ants do that. They colonised a planted plant within 12 months, I think. Spontaneously, or did you put the ants there? No, the ants were in the reserve. They were already in the reserve, but we planted the plants nearby and then expanded the habitat. The ants are, like I said, they're not something that move around a lot. So I think you're not going to just get the ant. People have asked me a lot, can I just plant this in my garden? I'll get Eltham coppers. It's not that easy. I think the ants are more restricted. And I suppose, like bees, they probably have to wait for the queen and set up a colony. There's ways that the ants would move a colony or start new colonies that you'd have to know that life cycle. Yeah. To know how to get them to inhabit a place. I know that. I think the Melbourne Museum actually wanted to have this species in their captivity, and they approached someone I was working with at the time years ago, because we were working the Eltham Copper, and they said, can you get us an ant colony somehow? We were coming up with these ideas, like we tried planting Baseria in this kind of cage system, and we were going to plant that and then get the ants to go in there and then like pull it out, but it was so... Didn't work. I'm sure someone could figure it out, but we haven't figured it out. But so where I did a management plan for the Botanical Gardens Reserve last year, I recommended having a lot of planting of Baseria in some of the more degraded areas, so that you might not be able to kind of plant Baseria in your house and get Eltham coppers, but even locally where they are, just expanding, because if it's just close enough to the ant colony, they'll self-populate to the next bit along. Yeah, because even having, like, say, in that Botanical Gardens Reserve, the Baseria's dropped out at some places, so we need to make sure we have enough across the whole reserve that they can actually, they can keep expanding and thriving, hopefully. Yeah, whenever I hear about this sort of complexity of knowledge about the interrelated relationships between plants and animals and all this stuff, I always just think about how much knowledge the Indigenous elders held about the landscape. Yeah. And how much that just was not understood by white colonists and invaders, and just completely disregarded. And now we're just, like, someone once upon a time probably knew that. Yeah. How the ants, there would have been a whole story about it, and now we don't know. Well, I mean, people call me an ecologist. I stand out as being someone who knows about ecology, but I think most Indigenous people, they were all ecologists. Like, they all, they lived on the land, and they were connected, and they kind of, and those relationships were just understood between plant, animal, and everything else. And they had totally different ways of seeing the world as well. Like, it wasn't always, like I was talking about taxonomy before, it's a human system and we kind of group things in certain ways. They would have had other ways of grouping it, from what I've heard. Different ways of, how you would group something. It might be more on relationship rather than how its genes are. It's like it's a whole different way of seeing things. So. Yeah. As often happens when I interview people, it's after we've said all of the things we'd planned to talk about and just sit there for a bit that an interesting new idea emerges as we stumble around wondering if there's anything else left to say. This was one of those occasions.
Is there anything else you want to say?
You had enough about saltgrass? Yeah.
Oh, is there more?
Well, that's like I said, it's not a plant I can talk about for hours.
I liked that it's a pioneer plant and, a stabiliser. And it's interesting. I think it is interesting, that idea that I think there's this sense that, we can just rehabilitate that, and I think we see this here in the goldfields is like the local Indigenous people, the Djajaran, call it upside down country because the gold mining here was so extensive that all the trees got cleared. Like you can see pictures from the 1800s where it's just mud fields for kilometres and kilometres, and all the good topsoil got discarded because they weren't interested in that. They were interested in the gold down below. And there's this idea kind of like, it doesn't matter what we do. We can just replant stuff. It'll be fine. But actually, some damage is irreparable or very, very, very difficult to repair. And you might get species like saltgrass making the best of it. And they're existing and they're sort of, stabilising the ground and holding it together. But it's not the same as it was, and it may not ever be the same as it was.
No, and I think, over my career I've become to accept that a lot of people have this mindset of trying to restore what was there in 1750 before whitefellas came, and I think that's not how ecosystems work. We can't get back to that because the whole landscape's changed, all the processes have changed. It's a completely different world. So there's a term called novel ecosystems, which is often that's where it's become something very different from pre-European, but it's still really functional. And I think we have a lot of really amazing novel ecosystems around here. Like some of the hills are quite intact, but some areas where it's very different to what it was, but it's still plenty of value. But it's about kind of thinking that ecosystems always change over time. They've been through massive upheaval through ice ages and all kinds of things over the time. So we're probably the biggest change in 60 million years, but there's
climate change will do even more than that.
Yeah. So we're going to see a lot of changes, and I think in some ways I think pre-1750 is a great guide because it's that was a peak of diversity in terms of what we've seen, and trying to get back to that in some way, but also just recognizing we've got different fire regimes, different climate, different soil profiles. Like I do a lot of stuff with Castlemaine Land Care along Forest Creek, and I mean we couldn't put back most of the original species because, like you said, it's upside down now. It's just pretty much gravel, and it would have had some lovely soil
clay
through there.
And shale.
Yeah. So you used to have this lovely kind of alluvial soils through that valley, and that's mostly all washed down the Loddon River somewhere, or probably the Murray. So, so you just got to recognise that and maybe adapt a bit. There's a whole kind of can of worms people talking about now, the climate change. Do we start planting, find what the analogue is for, say, Castlemaine and, what it'll be like. Find a town that we know the climate's going to be like
3 degrees warmer than Castlemaine.
Yeah.
And plant now for 20 years' time.
Which is, and that's kind of, we're moving towards that, and it's a lot of contention around that, and I can see why, but because, you're talking about something that might be 300-400 k's away, like planting that, or even further, like in really arid ecosystems, we start just planting salt bushes everywhere. I tend to think that will happen itself, and I don't. Yeah, it's a really tricky one though, and we're trying to mix up gene pools a bit though when we're doing revegetation now, because rather than, we used to have this idea of being really specific about only plant something that's within, say, 10-kilometre range to keep the genetic viability, like the genes that have developed in a certain area over time, try and retain that. But now it's like, well, we know we need more genetic diversity and possibly need gene pools from drier landscapes. So Damien Cook has been doing lots of plantings of red gum woodlands out of northern Victoria, has been experimenting with getting some red gums, just getting like some of the plants he puts back, getting some that are from further north, more arid areas, and just kind of mixing the gene pool up and mixing that up. So
even if you just have a couple of them, they could be the start of what's necessary in 20 years' time.
Yeah, and it'll interbreed, and it might the other kind of those drought tolerant genes will kind of be interbred with the population. But it's a huge question really about what do you restore now when we know it's changed so much, and also we know the changes that are happening with climate change. I think a lot of those changes will happen naturally as they always have. But we can start thinking more smartly about how to do revegetation and
stop yearning for yesteryear and trying to make things exactly as they used to be.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, especially with climate change, it's never going to be that again. Like even if we stop emissions right now and do lots of drawdown, we're still going to see a certain amount of global warming.
Yeah.
Like, it's just not going to...
Yeah, I don't want to get all gloomy, but there's this thing called Extinction Debt. It's talked about, like if we we suddenly became the best citizens of the world right now and did everything right, there's this debt we have because there's a lag in terms of how ecosystems work. So we'd still
and how carbon
continue.
exists in the atmosphere as well.
Yeah, it takes time. There's that lag.
Yeah,
yeah.
There's like 50 to 100 years worth of, like, it takes that long for it to get reabsorbed through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, just trying to be positive. We have been through major ice ages where the climate was very extreme, arid and dry, and we've been through, if you thought about the volcanic plains, pretty much, starting about 5 million years ago, some volcanoes started erupting across and blanketed a third of Victoria. It would have been pretty desolate. Like, there was some beautiful stuff underneath all that lava. Like, there's a lot of change that happens. I'm not trying to say climate change is a good thing, but just trying to be a bit positive about it's kind of ecology's, it actually is an evolving system. It's not this static pre-white fella thing. So
yeah, and it's not a garden that we can just control. Either. I think humans enjoy the idea of a garden where we get to choose what grows where, and we don't like the weeds, but we do like the pretty things and the things that we can eat. Yeah. But actually the world is a wilder, more turbulent kind of like system than that, I guess. Yeah,
it's tricky because I think when we step into a system, we change it in some way. So it's like, it is good to, so we kind of do become gardeners in a way, like we are part of the system. So it just depends on, and we have this very conscious way of being in the world, so we can actually choose, and we're quite mobile and we can do stuff. So it's choosing, almost can become creators of what do we want to put here, and not many animals can do that. It's like,
no, that's true.
So, but then it becomes this debate of, well, what should you do and how should you manage it?
What's the ethical implications of that?
Yeah, definitely. So,
and who gets to choose is the other question. Like, who the hell gets to make that decision for all of the species?
Exactly. But I mean, for me, the big things I want to work on the next few years is, try to stop logging a native forest, because that just should not continue. It's just ridiculous. We're still cutting down old growth forest.
Apparently Australia is one of the biggest logging countries in the world. Now.
Yeah,
it's insane.
Yeah, and I've been involved in some of the surveys, and it's like there's endangered species there and all kinds of things.
We can talk about the climate changing and everything changing and how change is a part of the natural world, but it doesn't mean we should just destroy what's there.
No, because people are saying, what should we do about climate change? And it's like, well, there's all these great things to do, but first of all, can we stop destroying? What are we doing that for? It's like, and everyone knows it's a loss-making industry. It's just it's corruption, and it just doesn't make any sense from what I see. So if we could do that kind of, and also a lot of the kind of out of control burning, cultural burning, I'm a huge fan of. And this kind of smaller scale burning for cultural reasons and for ecology reasons, but a lot of this vast burning of areas just to kind of make it seem like we're doing something to reduce fire risk when often it's not. And we've seen a lot of species going extinct from that process. So there's just things we've got to keep working on.
They call it fuel reduction burning, don't they?
Yeah, and that's a whole nother topic. But there's some science saying that if you do that within a certain vicinity of houses, it definitely works. But burning out the middle of the bush, it doesn't. If you do it every 3 years maybe, but it's not achievable. And there's other things we can do to reduce our risk to fire. So, and it's having a huge impact on our forest.
And the idea that the Australian bush is evolved to handle fire is also a myth, because, it's not a myth, it's true, but it's evolved to handle fire as managed by Indigenous cultural burns, not this current way of doing it.
Yeah, let's go back to that question again about this isn't pre-1750, this is a different ecosystem. So what they were burning was so different, and I imagine a lot of their burning would have been concentrated on the more fertile grassy plains, which we've turned into kind of agriculture now, and where our towns are, whereas a lot of the areas where our bushland reserves are was probably the less fertile country. Well, they would have done some burning, but it's such a changed system there now where there's all these things to consider we didn't have then. Like there's weeds to consider, there's the loss of old trees and hollows, which, you put these fires through and you lose your hollow-bearing trees.
Yeah, which is habitat for birds and other things. Is that what you're saying? Yeah,
so hollows are essential for a lot of our native animals, particularly some mammals. Mammals. There's something called the brush-tailed phascogale, one of our local threatened species, a mammal. A whole bunch of birds. Our species, they actually depend on having certain hollows of a certain size to actually breed and survive. So a lot of forests, as you're saying, they were cut down. So we don't have a lot of those hollows left, and when they put these burns through, they tend to lose the trees from burning out. So there's a lot we can do and keep fighting for, and I think it's always, you've got to stay positive, and getting really negative and hateful doesn't help anything, I think, but it can be hard because it's heartbreaking, but you've got to just try and work on these things while still staying positive.
I think especially as an ecologist, I imagine it's more heartbreaking for you because you actually know what's being sacrificed when these decisions are made at a sort of political level. Whereas other people will be like, don't take the forest away, it's pretty. You're like, no, but what about that species and that species and that species?
Yeah, we used to call it ecological depression. We'd have it on some of our field trips where you go to an area like, on the Murray where that just hadn't been flooded for years and things are dying. It was just, you knew so much of what was being lost and it was kind of hard. But there's so many positive stories out there. I don't want to be all negative. Like there's some great things happening, amazing restoration and regeneration happening. Like the Landcares of the Castlemaine region's got one of the highest density of landcare groups, I think, in Australia. It's incredible. The amount of different groups that are working on things, doing projects.
Yeah, I was going to say, if people listening wanted to get involved even in a small way, a landcare group is a great way to actually contribute and be guided by people who know what they're doing.
Yeah, definitely. If you live in the Castlemaine area, there's the Campbell's Creek Landcare Group. There's the Castlemaine Landcare Group, which is more on Forest Creek. There's those groups out at Harcourt. They're kind of all over. You could contact Connecting Country if you want to. They're a good guide for finding out what's in your patch. Yeah, and you go along to these events and you're kind of not as fun at the moment with just like everything because
COVID,
the whole COVID thing. But generally you go along to a planting and usually have a cup of tea and meet great people. And yeah, it's great for kids most of the time when they're not. Yeah,
getting into trouble.
Yeah, that's right. We're not. My son's always happy digging holes, but
don't dig that hole.
Yeah. As long as I'm digging out a plant.
I went for a bike ride along Happy Valley track one day and I saw a bunch of people and a table set out and an urn of tea and biscuits and they're all standing around chatting and having a nice time, and I stopped because I knew one of them and I was like, what's going on? This looks great. And he's like, oh, it's a local landcare group.
They're really nice events, especially when the weather's nice and things in spring. It's a beautiful thing to do and a positive way of giving back. And just to seeing like what's happened along, say, Forest Creek. I've only been up here over 10 years, but looking at photos from even the early 2000s or the late 90s, and it was pretty much because of the dredging that used to happen along there. There was just nothing. It was just gorse, and now you go along Forest Creek and it's just beautiful. There's so many woodlands being restored and lots of interesting birds, and so it's pretty inspiring to see. Yeah, like I said, it's not all doom and gloom. There's some amazing things happening. So
takes a bit of effort though. It's a shame that we have to put that effort in, but it's better to do it and to have avenues of doing that than falling into the despair of we're all screwed.
Yeah. Well, I think we were talking before about the carbon tax, and back when that was functioning for a few years, like the amount of money that started flowing to these connecting countries to get a lot of money to do some really grand schemes.
Lots of planting.
Heaps of planting, direct seeding. They had a whole bush crew. So unfortunately when they axed the carbon tax, a lot of that money disappeared, and now we just kind of occasionally there's these little spikes in funding and grants. It'd be great if that was more ongoing, but I suppose if people just keep supporting and making it clear that that's what they want, everyone's powerful and they can do their voting and support the environment, and hopefully we'll get more funding rolling. But there's huge potential. So and I suppose just having there's so much interest out there. I feel like there's a disconnect between how much funding comes from the government compared to the amount of interest is there, because most people, like the majority, don't support native logging. They want action on climate change, and there's this disconnect between what people want and what is actually happening. But just got to keep trying, I suppose.
So that was Karl Just, local ecologist, talking about what the plant saltgrass is, and also Eltham Copper Butterflies and the nature of nature. There are a couple of links to the things discussed in today's show at saltgrasspodcast.com. For those of you listening on Main FM or 3MDR, please note that you can listen to all episodes of Saltgrass on your podcasting app. If you can't find Saltgrass on your podcasting app, please let me know and we'll see what we can do to make it available there. You can go to saltgrasspodcast.com to find out how to contact me. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and please subscribe to our email list to get reminders and updates about the show. Again, you can do that by going to saltgrasspodcast.com. This program was made possible with support from Main FM and the Community Broadcasting Foundation. Find out more at cbf.org.au. My name is Ali Hanley. Thanks for listening.
Salt of the earth. Salt. Grassroots. Salt of the earth people. Grassroots change. Saltgrass.
Listen to all episodes of Saltgrass on your podcast app or at saltgrasspodcast.com.